All right, this morning I want to take you through a little bit of military research, just kind of show you how I work with larger projects, especially if I'm writing a story of someone for one of my books. And I want to show you the gold that I found as part of the research for this project. So this binder, normally I don't print my files out, they're all digitized, but I do have binders of the more important projects to me. And this gentleman right here is Fred Davis. He would have been the brother-in-law to Virginia Brauch, who was married to my flying tiger, Robert Brauch. If you've read my book, The Tiger's Widow, you know that Virginia ended up joining the Women's Army Corps, went to Egypt, where she met Fred's brother, Harvey, and they had a very long life together. Now, back in 2013, when I was starting to research Fred's service, when Ginny told me about him and showed me all of the family history that she had created, Fred just kept showing up. Every time I lectured, Fred would show up, so I would talk about Fred. Fred likes to be remembered because he's still buried overseas in St. Avold. And I have visited his grave. I was there in 2015. Now, as I'm researching Fred, sadly the service file burned, but I was able to get some morning reports, some basic information. I found a few newspaper articles in the Chicago Tribune, and also downloaded his missing aircrew report, which you can get those on Fold 3. That has quite a lot of information, normally testimonies, German information, that sort of thing. You can go take a look at those. The MACR, Missing Aircrew Report. Then I also received his IDPF. His IDPF also contains the X file that was created when the remains were disinterred by the Graves Registration. So when his bomber went down to November 1943, the crew was buried in an Austrian cemetery. And when Graves Registration disinterred those remains, they assigned them an X number, brought them to St. Avold, and began the identification process. Fred was temporarily buried then in St. Avold, and then his mother, because his widow had remarried, chose to have him permanently buried in St. Avold. His IDPF is a couple hundred pages long and contains quite a lot of information about his personal effects. We have letters from his mother, which gave me a ton of information about where he served, when he earned his flying wings, all these different clues that allowed me to then go search newspapers. Because when the service file burns, any extra information that we can find is so important. So these letters that come in the IDPF, and often you'll see letters in the OMPF, that service file, there might be just one little clue that will help you move the research forward. Or if you're working with a researcher like myself, help that person move the research project forward. A lot of information in here, a lot of identification information. Graves Registration made a map. They drew a map of where they recovered the remains of these service members, and just so much. Fred's IDPF is actually on my website under Research Resources at the World War II Research and Writing Center, so you can go and download it and take a look at what's there. One of the other things in his binder is just about Graves Registration, the 612th Graves Registration Company that has a lot of history. And actually, if you're interested in Graves Registration, this book you can find digitized online in quite a few places. Now, Fred was the co-pilot on the bomber that crashed to November 1943, and as I was searching newspapers, I didn't find a lot for him, and as I was Googling, I didn't find too much for him, until the point that I started researching the collaterals. And this is one big thing that Fred has taught me as I have done more research and as I go out and teach. Now, I knew this from my genealogy research, but it's really important to make sure that you know when you're doing military research, you want to search the collaterals. When I searched the pilot, the main pilot, Jeffries, I came upon this book written by Mark Bischoff, A Day in November. This book, I think, is over 800 pages long. I did print it out. It's in my binder, and it contains information on every single crew and all of the events of that mission. Mark scoured the German, Austrian, and American archives, missing aircrew reports, personnel files, IDPFs. He contacted family, and the book is rich with information. Unfortunately, he said he never published it because he didn't have he didn't have permission and copyright for all of the different photos. But I want to take you through just a few pages so you can see what's in here. He does have some photos from the National Archives, and he does have a whole chapter on Fred's crew. And not only does he have part of the missing aircrew report and information, what I learned right here is there was an Air Force accident report also for Fred and his crew. Now, when we think of Air Force accident reports, often we'll say, well, those were created when somebody died in a plane crash stateside, but that's not entirely true. Fred's crew just had an accident. Nobody was injured, nobody died. So I accessed the Air Force accident report for his crew, and you can get that at aviationarchaeology.com. They have for the Army, Air Forces, and the Navy, you can get those accident reports. And the plane was in Michigan getting ready to head overseas, and they had some kind of mechanical issue, and they ran into the hangar door. The prop was a little bit damaged. The hangar door was damaged. There are photos, of course, in these accident reports. They're not great because they're on microfilm. They're a little bit grainy, but the information is there. And that added another layer to his story that I wouldn't have known about, because at that point, I didn't realize that if people hadn't died, that there would be an Air Force accident report. This was very early in my military research career. Another thing that this book is rich on are photographs, not only of individuals, but entire crews. Then later in the book, I know there's a lot of pages to move through. He's got just so many histories and copies of military records in here, and then copies of crash site photos in Austria. This book is rich in materials. So this is one example of what you can learn about someone if you are doing that military research and you are searching the collaterals and you are really going in depth on what is possible there. So, what have you discovered as you have done your research? Have you searched the collaterals? Did you discover anything else really interesting in your research? Have you learned about the other crews on the missions? If you are researching a bomb crew, always research those other crews too, because sometimes records get placed in those other folders, in those other files. Things happened, mistakes were made. So, what do you think? Have you hit gold as you've done your military research? I'd love to know what you found.